The morning sun beat down on the Naval Special Warfare Training Facility in Coronado, California. It was just another Tuesday for the elite warriors who called this place home. The sound of boots hitting pavement echoed across the compound as teams of SEALs moved between training exercises. This was their world, a place where only the strongest, fastest, and most skilled could survive. At exactly 9:15 a.m., an old blue Honda Civic pulled up to the main gate. The car had seen better days. Paint was peeling near the rear bumper, and there was a small dent on the driver's side door. Nothing about this vehicle screamed military or importance. It looked like something a retired teacher might drive to the grocery store. The security guard barely looked up from his clipboard as the car approached. He was used to seeing fancy military vehicles, government SUVs, and the occasional sports car belonging to visiting officials. This beat-up Honda wasn't worth a second glance, but then the window rolled down and he saw the driver. Harold Mitchell looked every bit of his 68 years. His gray hair was thinning on top, and deep lines mapped the corners of his eyes, wire-rimmed. Glasses sat slightly crooked on his nose, and his hands gripped the steering wheel, with the careful attention of someone who had learned to drive when cars were built differently. He wore a simple white polo shirt that had been washed so many times it was more cream than white, and his khaki pants had a permanent crease from being ironed the same way for decades. "Good morning, sir," the guard said, his tone polite but routine. "How can I help you today?" Harold's voice was soft, almost apologetic. "I'm here for the Veteran Outreach Program. Someone called me about coming in today." He reached into his shirt pocket with slightly shaking fingers and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The paper looked like it had been read and refolded several times. The guard took the paper and scanned it quickly. Everything seemed to be in order. Harold Mitchell, age 68, retired, veteran status confirmed. The kind of paperwork they saw regularly for these community programs. Nothing special, nothing that would make anyone look twice. "Park in visitor spot number 3, the guard said, handing back the paper. "Check in at the main desk inside. They'll get you sorted out." Harold nodded and drove slowly through the gate. His car moved at exactly the speed limit, no faster, no slower. He parked carefully between the white lines, making sure his old Honda was perfectly centered. From the passenger seat, he lifted an old leather gun case. The case was brown and worn, with scratches and scuff marks that told stories of decades of use. The brass clasps were tarnished but still worked perfectly. Walking toward the main building, Harold looked around with quiet interest. Young SEALs jogged past him in formation, their boots hitting the ground in perfect rhythm. Their bodies were machines of muscle and determination, moving with the confidence that came from knowing they were among the best in the world. Next to them, Harold looked like someone's grandfather who had gotten lost on his way to the library. The main lobby was buzzing with activity. Military personnel moved with purpose, carrying files, equipment, and the weight of important missions. The receptionist, a woman in her 30s with short blonde hair and sharp eyes, was handling 3 phone calls while typing on her computer. She was the kind of person who could manage chaos without breaking a sweat. Harold stood patiently at the desk, his gun case in one hand and his paperwork in the other. He didn't clear his throat or tap on the counter. He simply waited, like he had all the time in the world. The receptionist finished her calls and looked up. "Sorry about the wait. How can I help you?" "I'm Harold Mitchell. I believe someone's expecting me for the veteran program today." His voice was so quiet she had to lean forward to hear him properly. She checked her computer screen, scrolling through the day's appointments. "Ah, yes, Mr. Mitchell. You're here for the range familiarization program. Let me get someone to escort you." She picked up her phone and dialed an extension. "Chief Rodriguez? Your 9:30 appointment is here." While they waited, Harold stood quietly, observing everything around him. He watched the young sailors and SEALs moving through the lobby with their purposeful energy. Their uniforms were crisp, their movements sharp and efficient. Everything about them spoke of training, discipline, and capability. They moved like they owned the world, and in many ways they did. Chief Petty Officer Carlos Rodriguez appeared after a few minutes. He was a man in his 40s, built like a tank, with arms that looked like they could bend steel bars. His uniform was perfectly pressed and his shoes shined like mirrors. When he walked, other military personnel stepped aside automatically. This was a man who commanded respect without saying a word. Rodriguez looked at Harold and felt a moment of confusion. The old man standing before him looked nothing like what he expected. Veterans came in all shapes and sizes, but something about this particular visitor seemed almost fragile. His clothes hung loose on his thin frame, and his eyes had the gentle quality of someone who spent his days reading newspapers and feeding pigeons in the park. "Mr. Mitchell?" Rodriguez extended his hand. Harold's grip was firm, but not aggressive, the handshake of someone who was polite but not trying to prove anything. "Thank you for having me, Chief. I appreciate the opportunity." Rodriguez studied the older man more carefully. There was something in Harold's eyes that didn't quite match his gentle appearance. Not hardness exactly, but a depth that suggested he had seen things that most people never would. Still, he looked like a strong breeze might knock him over. "What branch did you serve in, Mr. Mitchell?" "Marines," Harold replied simply. "Long time ago." Rodriguez nodded with new respect. Marines were Marines, regardless of age. "Well, sir, we're happy to have you here. The range is part of our community outreach program. We like to give veterans a chance to shoot with some modern equipment, see how we train today." They walked through corridors lined with photographs of SEAL teams, historical missions, and fallen heroes. Harold looked at each image with quiet attention, his eyes moving slowly from face to face. Some of the young men in the photos looked barely old enough to vote, let alone carry out the dangerous missions that had made them legends. "The program is pretty informal," Rodriguez explained as they walked. "We'll show you around. Let you observe some training if you're interested, and if you want to shoot, we can set you up with a lane after our guys finish their qualifications." Harold nodded. "That sounds fine. I don't want to get in anyone's way. You mentioned you wanted to bring your own rifle?" Rodriguez glanced at the gun case Harold was carrying. "If that's all right. It's an old friend. We've been together a long time." Rodriguez smiled. He understood the relationship between a man and his weapon. "No problem at all. We'll need to inspect it for safety, standard procedure, but I'm sure it'll be fine." They reached the armory, where Rodriguez handled the paperwork for Harold's visit. The forms were standard military bureaucracy: name, rank, serial number, next of kin. Harold filled them out with careful handwriting, taking his time with each line. His writing was neat but showed the slight tremor that came with age. "Any medical conditions we should know about?" Rodriguez asked, following protocol. "Nothing that affects my shooting," Harold replied with what might have been the hint of a smile. Rodriguez led him toward the outdoor range complex. The sound of gunfire grew louder as they approached, the sharp crack of rifles and the deeper boom of larger weapons. It was a sound Harold knew well, though he gave no indication that it affected him in any way. "Our guys are just finishing up their morning qualifications," Rodriguez explained. "Should be clear in about 20 minutes. While we wait, would you like to see the facility?" Harold nodded, and they began a tour of one of the most advanced training facilities in the world. Rodriguez pointed out various training areas, explained different programs, and shared stories about the incredible men who trained there. Harold listened politely, asking occasional questions that showed he understood more about military operations than his appearance might suggest. As they walked, several SEALs noticed the elderly visitor. Some nodded respectfully when they saw him with Chief Rodriguez, automatically showing deference to any veteran, regardless of age. Others barely glanced at him, focused on their own training and missions. None of them could have imagined that, within the next hour, this quiet old man would change everything they thought they knew about shooting. The sound of the final shots echoed across the range as the last group of SEALs finished their morning qualification. Steam rose from the hot rifle barrels in the California sun, and the smell of gunpowder hung thick in the air. It was a smell that Harold recognized instantly, though his face showed no reaction. He simply stood beside Chief Rodriguez, patiently waiting his turn like a customer in line at the bank. "All right, gentlemen, range is clear," Rodriguez called out to his men. "Pack it up and let's get ready for the next exercise." The SEALs began collecting their gear with the efficiency that came from years of practice. Every movement was precise. Every action had a purpose. They handled their weapons like extensions of their own bodies, cleaning barrels, checking magazines, and storing equipment in exactly the right places. These were men who could disassemble and reassemble a rifle blindfolded in under 2 minutes. As they prepared to leave, several of the younger SEALs noticed Harold standing off to the side with his old gun case. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Here were some of the most elite warriors in the world, loaded down with high-tech equipment worth thousands of dollars, and beside them stood an elderly man who looked like he should be playing checkers at the senior center. "Who's the old-timer, Chief?" asked Petty Officer Danny Kim, a compact Korean-American who had joined the team straight out of college. At 26, Kim was already considered one of the better marksmen in his unit, but he still had the cocky confidence that came with youth and success. "Veteran Outreach Program," Rodriguez replied. "Mr. Mitchell here served with the Marines, back in the day. Wants to do some shooting." Kim nodded respectfully, but Harold caught the slight smile that crossed his face. It wasn't mean-spirited, just the natural reaction of a young man who couldn't imagine someone his grandfather's age keeping up with modern military standards. To Kim and his buddies, Harold probably seemed like a relic from a different era entirely. "What kind of rifle you got there, sir?" asked Tommy Chen, another young SEAL who prided himself on knowing every weapon system in the military arsenal. Chen was the kind of guy who read gun magazines for fun and could tell you the muzzle velocity of 50 different cartridges off the top of his head. Harold set his case down carefully and opened the brass clasps. They made a satisfying click that spoke of quality craftsmanship from a time when things were built to last forever. Inside, nestled in faded green foam, was a rifle that made several of the SEALs raise their eyebrows. It was a Remington 700, but not the modern tactical version they were used to seeing. This was an older model, probably from the 1970s, with a wooden stock that had been carefully maintained over the decades. The metal showed some honest wear, but everything about the rifle spoke of meticulous care. The scope was a simple Leupold, nothing fancy by today's standards, but Harold had mounted it perfectly and the glass was crystal clear. "Nice classic setup," Chen said, though his tone suggested he was just being polite. "Don't see many of those wooden stocks anymore." Harold lifted the rifle from its case with movements that were deliberate but seemed uncertain to the watching SEALs. His hands shook slightly as he checked the action, and he had to adjust his glasses twice while examining the scope. To the young warriors watching, he looked like someone handling a precision instrument for the first time in years. "This old girl and I have been together for about 40 years, Harold said quietly, running his weathered fingers along the stock. "She's not much to look at anymore, but she still shoots straight." The SEALs exchanged glances that they thought Harold couldn't see. 40 years was longer than most of them had been alive. In their world of constantly upgraded equipment and cutting-edge technology, a 40-year-old rifle seemed like something that belonged in a museum, not on a military shooting range. Rodriguez, being older and more diplomatic than his men, stepped forward to inspect the weapon properly. As rangemaster, it was his responsibility to ensure that any civilian firearm met safety standards before being used on the base. "Mind if I take a look, Mr. Mitchell?" Harold handed over the rifle without hesitation. Rodriguez examined it with professional thoroughness, checking the bolt, the trigger mechanism, and the scope mounting. Despite its age, everything was in perfect working order. The bore was clean enough to eat off, and the trigger broke at exactly the right weight. Someone had spent serious time maintaining this weapon. "This is a beautiful rifle, sir," Rodriguez said, and he meant it. "You've taken excellent care of it." "My dad taught me that a man takes care of his tools," Harold replied. "Whether it's a hammer or a rifle, you treat it with respect, and it'll serve you well." Rodriguez nodded and handed the weapon back. "What kind of shooting did you do in the Marines, if you don't mind me asking?" Harold's answer was so quiet that several of the SEALs had to lean in to hear him. A little bit of everything, whatever needed doing. It was the kind of answer that said nothing and everything at the same time. The older SEALs in the group recognized it immediately, the response of someone who had done things he didn't like to talk about. But to the younger men, it just sounded like an old veteran being modest about hunting trips and target practice. "Well, sir, let's get you set up," Rodriguez said, leading Harold toward the shooting line. "We'll start you off at the 100-yard targets, see how you feel." Harold paused and looked downrange toward the targets. His eyes, magnified slightly by his glasses, seemed to be calculating something. "Chief, would it be possible to try the 300-yard line instead?" The request caught Rodriguez off guard. 300 yards was serious distance shooting, the kind that required skill, experience, and intimate knowledge of your weapon. Most civilian shooters were happy to hit paper at 100 yards, let alone group shots at 3 times that distance. "Are you sure, sir? 300 is pretty challenging even for experienced shooters." Harold's response was delivered with the same quiet confidence he'd shown since arriving. "I'd like to try, if that's all right." Rodriguez shrugged. It was the man's choice, and there was no harm in letting him attempt it. "No problem. Tommy, can you set up a target at the 300 line?" As Chen jogged downrange to set up a fresh target, the other SEALs began to gather around. Word had spread that the old civilian was going to attempt some serious distance shooting, and everyone wanted to see what would happen. Most expected to witness a polite failure, an elderly man discovering that his eyes and hands weren't what they used to be. Harold took his position at the shooting bench with movements that seemed awkward at first. He adjusted the height of his seat twice, moved his shooting rest several times, and spent what seemed like an eternity getting comfortable. The watching SEALs grew a bit restless, accustomed to the quick, efficient movements of trained operators. But as Harold settled into his final position, something changed. The uncertainty disappeared from his movements, replaced by a stillness that was almost unnatural. His breathing became slow and controlled, his hands stopped shaking entirely, and his eyes took on a focus that seemed to shut out everything except the target 300 yards away. Rodriguez handed him a box of match-grade ammunition, the good stuff that the military used for precision shooting. Harold loaded 5 rounds into his magazine with smooth, practiced motions that were completely different from the fumbling movements he'd shown just minutes earlier. "Take your time, sir," Rodriguez said. "No pressure." Harold nodded and brought his rifle to his shoulder. The transformation was complete now. Gone was the uncertain elderly man who had seemed lost in a world of elite warriors. In his place was someone who handled the weapon like it was part of his own body. Someone who understood the relationship between breath, heartbeat, and trigger squeeze at a level that couldn't be taught in any school. The first shot cracked across the range with authority. It was followed immediately by Chen's voice over the radio from the target line. "Bullseye, dead center." A few of the SEALs looked at each other with raised eyebrows, but one good shot could be luck. Harold worked the bolt smoothly and lined up his second shot. Again, the rifle spoke with confidence, and again Chen's voice confirmed. Another perfect hit. By the third shot, the casual conversations among the watching SEALs had stopped completely. This wasn't beginner's luck or a fluke. Harold was shooting with a precision that most of them couldn't match on their best days. His breathing technique was textbook perfect, his follow-through was flawless, and his trigger control showed the kind of muscle memory that only came from thousands of hours of practice. Rodriguez raised his binoculars to get a better look at the target. What he saw made him blink and look again. 3 shots fired by a 68-year-old man with a 40-year-old rifle, grouped in a circle smaller than a quarter at 300 yards. It was the kind of shooting that belonged in record books, not on a casual range day with a visiting civilian. The 4th and 5th shots confirmed what everyone was beginning to realize. Harold Mitchell might look like someone's grandfather, but he could shoot better than most of the elite warriors watching him. His final group of 5 shots could have been covered by a silver dollar, a feat that defied explanation, given his age and equipment. As Harold set his rifle down and removed his ear protection, the news spread through the base like wildfire. Within minutes of Harold's incredible shooting display, word was traveling through every corridor, cafeteria, and training room in the facility. "There's an old guy on the range shooting better than anyone we've ever seen." That was the message being passed from one SEAL to another, each retelling making the story sound more unbelievable. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Wells was in the middle of reviewing training schedules when her phone buzzed with a text from one of her instructors. "You need to get to the range right now. Something crazy is happening." Wells had been in the Navy for 15 years and had seen enough crazy things to know that when experienced SEALs used that word, it meant something truly extraordinary was taking place. She walked quickly across the compound, her curiosity growing with each step. As she approached the range, she could see an unusual crowd gathering. SEALs who should have been at other training exercises were finding excuses to drift over toward the shooting area. Instructors were abandoning their lesson plans, and even some of the administrative staff had found reasons to step outside. At the center of it all sat Harold, calmly cleaning his rifle with a piece of cloth that looked as old as the weapon itself. He seemed completely unaware of the attention he was drawing, focused entirely on the simple task of maintaining his equipment. The same careful movements, the same quiet concentration he had shown since arriving that morning. "Chief Rodriguez, what's going on here?" Wells asked as she approached the rangemaster. Rodriguez's face wore an expression somewhere between amazement and confusion. "Ma'am, you're not going to believe this until you see it for yourself. This gentleman just put 5 shots into a group smaller than a quarter at 300 yards, with iron sights and a rifle older than most of our guys." Wells looked at Harold, trying to process what she was hearing. The man sitting at the bench looked like he should be worried about his blood pressure medication, not setting shooting records that would impress Olympic marksmen. "Are you sure about the measurement?" "I checked it 3 times, Rodriguez replied. "And that's not even the strangest part. Watch how he shoots. It's like watching a master craftsman at work." More SEALs continued to arrive, drawn by curiosity, and the kind of military grapevine that could spread news faster than any communication system ever invented. Among them was Petty Officer First Class Jake Morrison, the base's acknowledged shooting champion. Morrison had earned his reputation the hard way, through 2 combat deployments where his sniper skills had saved countless lives and eliminated high-value targets. Morrison was the kind of man other SEALs looked up to. At 32, he was in his physical prime, with reflexes like a cat and eyesight that could spot a target at distances that would challenge most people with binoculars. His personal rifle was a work of art, a custom-built precision instrument that cost more than most people's cars. When Morrison shot, other shooters stopped what they were doing to watch and learn. "Is this the old-timer everyone's talking about?" Morrison asked, nodding toward Harold. "That's him," Rodriguez confirmed. "Mr. Mitchell, I'd like you to meet Petty Officer Morrison. Jake's our top shooter here at the facility." Harold looked up from cleaning his rifle and extended his hand. Morrison's grip was firm and confident, the handshake of someone accustomed to being the best at what he did. But as their eyes met, Morrison felt something unexpected. There was no challenge in Harold's gaze, no competitiveness or need to prove anything, just a quiet acknowledgement from one shooter to another. "Pleasure to meet you, son," Harold said in his soft voice. "I hear you're quite accomplished with a rifle." Morrison studied the older man more carefully. Up close, Harold looked even more ordinary than he had from a distance. His clothes were the kind you'd find at any discount store, his shoes were practical rather than stylish, and his hands showed the calluses and scars of someone who had worked with his hands his entire life. Nothing about him suggested the kind of shooting skill that had apparently impressed an entire base full of elite warriors. "What kind of groups are you shooting?" Morrison asked, genuinely curious. Harold's answer was delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to discuss the weather. "Pretty tight, I suppose, haven't measured them in years, never seemed that important." The casual response caught Morrison off guard. In his world, every shot was measured, analyzed, and recorded. Precision shooting was a science of millimeters and minutes of angle, where the difference between good and great could be measured in fractions of inches. The idea of someone shooting at this level without caring about the exact measurements seemed almost impossible to comprehend. "Would you mind if I watched you shoot a few more?" Morrison asked. Harold nodded and began loading his rifle again. "Happy to. Though I should warn you, this old rifle's got some quirks. Takes a special touch to get the best out of her." As Harold prepared for his next series of shots, Lieutenant Commander Wells quietly spoke with Chief Rodriguez about making this more official. If what she was hearing was true, they might be witnessing something that deserved proper documentation. The base kept detailed records of all shooting achievements, both for training purposes and to recognize exceptional performance. "Chief, what's our current facility record for long-range precision shooting?" she asked. Rodriguez pulled out his clipboard and flipped through several pages of scores and statistics. Depends on the distance and conditions, ma'am. At 500 yards, Morrison holds the record with a 98 out of 100. At 800 yards, it's also Morrison with a 94 out of 100. Wells did some quick mental calculations. If Harold could shoot the kind of groups Rodriguez was describing, there was a good chance he might be capable of challenging those records. The thought seemed almost ridiculous, but the evidence was right in front of her eyes. "Mr. Mitchell," she called out, "would you be interested in trying some longer distances? We have targets set up out to 800 yards. Harold paused in his rifle preparation and looked downrange toward the distant targets. His aged eyes seemed to be making calculations that no one else could understand. After a long moment, he nodded slowly. "I suppose I could give it a try. Been a while since I shot that far, but muscle memory has a way of sticking around." The crowd around the range had grown to include nearly 30 people now. SEALs, instructors, support staff, and even a few officers who had heard the rumors and come to see for themselves. This was shaping up to be something that would be talked about for years to come, regardless of what happened next. Morrison stepped forward with the confidence of someone who had never been outshot on his home range. "Mr. Mitchell, if you don't mind, I'd like to make this interesting. Our current 800-yard record is 94 out of 100. 10 shots, scored for accuracy and precision. Would you be willing to take a shot at it?" Harold considered the challenge. For a moment, his weathered fingers drumming thoughtfully on the stock of his rifle. "What's the current record holder get out of this?" Morrison grinned, the kind of smile that came from supreme confidence in his own abilities. "Bragging rights mostly, and the knowledge that they're the best shooter on the base. And if an old man like me somehow managed to beat that record, then I guess an old man like you becomes the best shooter on the base," Morrison replied. "But I have to warn you, 94 out of 100 at 800 yards is no joke. That's shooting at a level that most people never reach, even with years of professional training." Harold nodded slowly, as if he was considering something much more complex than a simple shooting competition. "I appreciate the warning, son, but sometimes an old dog still remembers a few tricks." Lieutenant Commander Wells realized she was about to witness something that would either be an embarrassing failure or an absolutely legendary performance. Either way, it needed to be properly documented. She called over to one of her staff members. "Get a camera set up and make sure we have fresh targets at the 800 line. If we're doing this, we're doing it right." As the preparations began, Harold sat quietly at his shooting bench, methodically preparing his equipment. He checked his scope one more time, adjusted his shooting rest, and arranged his ammunition with the careful precision of someone who left nothing to chance. Around him, the crowd continued to grow as more and more people heard about what was happening. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Here was a 68-year-old civilian with a rifle older than most of the people watching, about to challenge a record set by one of the most skilled snipers in the military. It was David versus Goliath, except David looked like he should be home watching television and drinking coffee. But as Harold settled into his shooting position, that same transformation occurred that had amazed everyone earlier. The uncertain elderly man disappeared, replaced by someone who moved with the fluid precision of a master craftsman. His breathing slowed, his hands steadied, and his eyes took on the focused intensity of someone who had done this exact thing thousands of times before. The crowd fell silent as Harold chambered his first round. 800 yards stretched out before him, a distance where the slightest error in judgment could send a bullet completely off target. The wind was light, but variable, the kind of condition that separated good shooters from great ones. The silence on the range was unlike anything most of the SEALs had ever experienced. Even during the most intense training exercises, there was always some background noise, radios crackling, equipment shifting, someone giving quiet instructions. But now, with nearly 40 elite warriors and support staff watching one elderly man prepare to shoot, you could have heard a pin drop on the concrete. Harold adjusted his position one final time, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The shooting bench had been set up perfectly, the sandbags positioned just right, and his ammunition laid out in a neat row beside him. Everything was exactly as it should be, arranged with the kind of careful attention to detail that separated professionals from amateurs. But then something unexpected happened. As Harold brought his rifle to his shoulder for the first shot, his hands began to shake. It was subtle at first, just a slight tremor that might have been dismissed as normal for a man his age. But as the seconds passed, the shaking became more pronounced, visible enough that several of the watching SEALs exchanged knowing glances. Morrison, standing behind Harold with his binoculars ready, felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief because his record was probably safe from this elderly challenger, and disappointment because he had genuinely hoped to see something extraordinary. The pressure of performing in front of so many elite warriors had apparently gotten to the old man, just as it would have to anyone who wasn't used to this level of scrutiny. "Take your time, sir," Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying the professional courtesy that one shooter always showed another. "There's no rush." Harold nodded without taking his eye from the scope. His breathing was controlled, but his hands continued to tremble as he tried to line up his first shot. The crosshairs danced across the distant target like leaves in a breeze, never quite settling where they needed to be. Several seconds passed, then a full minute, and still Harold hadn't fired. Lieutenant Commander Wells watched with growing concern. She had seen this before with older veterans who overestimated their current abilities based on past performance. Age was unforgiving, especially when it came to the fine motor control required for precision shooting. She was already thinking about how to handle this situation gracefully, how to let Harold save face while acknowledging that some challenges were better left unattempted. Chief Rodriguez stood with his arms crossed, feeling responsible for allowing this situation to develop. He should have known better than to let an elderly civilian attempt something that challenged even the best shooters on the base. The smart thing would be to call this off now before Harold embarrassed himself in front of everyone. But then, something remarkable happened. As Harold continued to breathe slowly and steadily, the tremor in his hands began to fade. It didn't happen gradually. It stopped all at once, as if someone had flipped a switch inside his body. His grip on the rifle became rock solid. His breathing deepened into the rhythmic pattern of someone who had done this thousands of times before, and the crosshairs settled on the target with the precision of a machine. The transformation was so complete and so sudden that it caught everyone off guard. One moment Harold had looked like a nervous amateur struggling with equipment beyond his capabilities, and the next he had become something else entirely. His entire body seemed to settle into the shooting position with a stillness that was almost supernatural. The first shot cracked across the range with authority. The sound echoed off the surrounding buildings and rolled across the training grounds like thunder. Morrison immediately raised his binoculars to check the target, expecting to see a miss, or at best a marginal hit somewhere in the outer rings. "Dead. Center," he called out, his voice carrying a note of surprise that he couldn't quite hide. "Perfect 10. A murmur ran through the crowd, but Harold seemed not to hear it. He was already working the bolt of his rifle with smooth, practiced movements, ejecting the spent brass and chambering a fresh round. His focus was complete, his attention locked entirely on the distant target as if nothing else in the world existed. The second shot followed within seconds of the first. Again, Morrison's binoculars snapped to the target, and again his voice carried across the range with growing amazement. Another 10. Right next to the first shot. By now, the crowd had grown completely silent. Even the background sounds of the bass seemed to have faded away, leaving only the rhythmic breathing of one elderly man and the occasional metallic click of his bolt action. Harold's shooting rhythm was hypnotic. Breathe, aim, fire, reload, repeat. Each movement flowed into the next with the kind of mechanical precision that spoke of muscle memory burned in over decades of practice. Shot 3, shot 4, shot 5. Each one announced by Morrison's increasingly incredulous voice calling out perfect scores. The electronic scoring system confirmed what everyone was seeing. Harold was shooting with a level of precision that defied explanation. His group was tighter than anything Morrison had ever achieved, tighter than what most people would have thought possible with any rifle, let alone a 40-year-old hunting gun. Lieutenant Commander Wells found herself holding her breath as Harold prepared for his 6th shot. She had witnessed some incredible feats of marksmanship during her career, but nothing quite like this. There was something almost supernatural about the way this ordinary-looking old man had transformed into a shooting machine. The trembling hands, the uncertain movements, the apparent nervousness, all of it had vanished the moment he settled into his shooting position. Shot 6. Another perfect 10. The crowd was no longer just watching. They were witnessing something that would become legend on this base. Some of the younger SEALs were recording with their phones, though photography was normally restricted on the range. Nobody wanted to miss documenting what might be the most incredible shooting performance anyone had ever seen. Morrison, despite being the current record holder, found himself rooting for Harold to continue his perfect streak. As a shooter himself, he understood the incredible difficulty of what he was witnessing. 800 yards was serious distance shooting, the kind where atmospheric conditions, wind speed, temperature, and even the Earth's rotation could affect bullet placement. To maintain this level of accuracy, shot after shot required not just skill, but an almost mystical understanding of ballistics and environmental factors. Shot 7 came with the same mechanical precision as the others. Harold's breathing never varied, his position never shifted, and his trigger squeeze remained consistent enough to set a metronome by. Morrison called out another perfect score, his voice now carrying a note of genuine awe. "How is this possible?" whispered one of the younger SEALs to his buddy. "That rifle shouldn't even be capable of this kind of accuracy." But older, more experienced shooters in the crowd understood what they were seeing. This wasn't about the rifle. It was about the man behind it. Harold had reached that level of shooting mastery where the weapon became an extension of his own body, where years of practice had created an almost supernatural connection between shooter and target. Shot 8. Perfect 10. The group was now so tight that the bullet holes were beginning to overlap, creating what looked like a single, slightly larger hole in the center of the target. It was the kind of shooting that belonged in record books, the kind that other marksmen would talk about for decades to come. As Harold prepared for his 9th shot, even Morrison found his confidence shaken. His own record of 94 out of 100 had seemed untouchable when he set it 6 months earlier. He had been shooting at the top of his game that day, with perfect conditions and his custom rifle performing flawlessly. But Harold was shooting a perfect 100 with equipment that belonged in a museum, under the pressure of having 40 elite warriors watching his every move. The 9th shot rang out across the range. Morrison didn't even need his binoculars to call this one. He could see through the scope on the spotting rifle that Harold had placed another bullet in exactly the same spot as the previous 8. "Perfect 10, Morrison announced, his voice now carrying genuine respect. 9 for 9. Harold paused before his final shot, taking a moment to check his rifle and adjust his position slightly. The crowd held its collective breath, understanding that they were about to witness either the completion of a perfect score or see how this remarkable old man handled pressure at the crucial moment. For the first time since he had started shooting, Harold looked up from his scope and glanced around at the watching crowd. His eyes behind those wire-rimmed glasses showed no nervousness, no pressure, just the calm focus of someone who had been in similar situations before. He nodded once to Morrison, a gesture of respect between shooters, and then settled back into his position. The 10th and final shot seemed to hang in the air longer than the others, though that was probably just the imagination of everyone watching. When the sound faded away, Morrison raised his binoculars one last time, knowing that what he saw would either confirm one of the most incredible shooting performances in military history, or reveal that even masters could falter under pressure. What he saw made him lower his binoculars and shake his head in amazement before announcing the final score. Perfect 10, 100 out of 100. Ladies and gentlemen, we just witnessed perfection. The applause gradually died down, but the energy on the range remained electric. Harold methodically packed his rifle back into its worn leather case, his movements as careful and deliberate as they had been all day. He cleaned each component thoroughly, checking the action one final time before closing the brass clasps with their familiar click. To him, this seemed like the natural end to a pleasant afternoon of shooting. To everyone watching, it felt like they had just witnessed something that would be talked about for generations. Lieutenant Commander Wells was the first to approach him, her mind still struggling to process what she had just seen. In 15 years of military service, she had worked with some of the most elite soldiers in the world. She had seen incredible feats of strength, endurance, and skill that pushed the boundaries of human capability. But nothing had prepared her for watching a 68-year-old civilian achieve perfection with a rifle that belonged in a museum. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying the respect that one professional shows another. "That was absolutely remarkable. I've never seen shooting like that in my entire career." Harold looked up from his gun case and smiled the same gentle smile he had worn since arriving that morning. "Thank you, ma'am. It felt good to shoot again. Been a while since I had access to a proper range with good distances." The simplicity of his response only added to the mystery. Here was a man who had just achieved something that most marksmen could only dream of, and he was talking about it like he had just enjoyed a pleasant walk in the park. There was no boasting, no excitement, no indication that he understood the magnitude of what he had accomplished. Chief Rodriguez stepped forward, his curiosity finally overcoming his professional reserve. "Sir, I have to ask, what exactly was your background in the Marines? Because what we just saw doesn't come from weekend hunting trips." Harold paused in his packing and looked thoughtfully at the group of elite warriors surrounding him. A moment. His eyes held something different. Not the gentle uncertainty they had shown all day, but a depth that suggested experiences most people could never imagine. Then the moment passed, and he was once again the quiet old man who seemed almost apologetic for taking up their time. "I did a little shooting in the service," he said quietly. "Different war, different rifles, but the principles remain the same." Morrison, still holding his binoculars, shook his head in amazement. "Sir, with all due respect, that wasn't a little shooting. What you just did requires thousands of hours of practice, maybe tens of thousands. That kind of muscle memory doesn't develop overnight." Harold nodded slowly as if he was considering how much to reveal. "You're right, son. I suppose I did put in some time behind a rifle. Had to, really. It was my job." The crowd of SEALs pressed closer, their curiosity now fully aroused. They were used to meeting military legends, but those legends usually came with reputations that preceded them. Harold had appeared out of nowhere, looking like any other elderly veteran, and had proceeded to demonstrate skills that surpassed anything they had ever witnessed. "What kind of job required that level of shooting?" Wells asked, her tone gentle but persistent. Harold was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands resting on his gun case. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "I was a sniper in Vietnam. 2 tours, 1968 to 1970. Did what needed doing over there." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of understanding that spread through the watching crowd. Vietnam. The most controversial war in American history, fought by young men who had returned home to a country that often treated them as villains rather than heroes. For many of that generation, military service was something they rarely discussed, especially the parts that involved taking lives. Rodriguez felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. "What unit, sir?" "1st Battalion, 3rd Marines." "Scout. Sniper platoon." Harold's voice was barely above a whisper now, but every person on the range heard him clearly. "They called us different things back then. Some not so nice." Morrison, who had studied military history and sniper tactics extensively, felt his breath catch. He knew enough about Vietnam-era snipers to understand the implications of what Harold was saying. Those men had operated under conditions that made modern warfare look civilized by comparison. They had worked alone or in pairs deep in enemy territory, with equipment that was primitive by today's standards. "How many tours did you say?" Wells asked, though she had heard him perfectly the first time. 2 complete tours. Was working on a third when things started winding down. Command decided they didn't need old-timers like me anymore. Harold's smile carried a sadness that spoke of memories he rarely shared. "Probably for the best. I was starting to lose track of which war I was fighting." One of the younger SEALs, a man barely out of his 20s, raised his hand tentatively. "Sir, if you don't mind me asking, How many confirmed kills did you have? The question hung in the air like smoke from a rifle barrel. It was the kind of question that was both inevitable and intensely personal. For snipers, confirmed kills were a grim statistic that measured effectiveness while carrying the weight of human lives ended with precision and deliberation. Harold looked at the young SEAL for a long moment, seeing something in his face that reminded him of himself at that age. Young, eager, convinced that he was invincible, and that war was something that happened to other people. It was a look that Harold had seen in mirrors before Vietnam taught him otherwise. 87 confirmed, he said finally. Probably more that couldn't be verified. Hard to know for sure when you're shooting at ranges where you can't always check your work. The number hit the crowd like a physical force. 87 confirmed kills meant that Harold had been one of the most effective snipers in military history. Modern snipers with advanced equipment and extensive training considered themselves successful with a fraction of that number. To achieve those results with 1960s technology, in the hostile environment of Vietnam, spoke to a level of skill that bordered on the supernatural. Morrison found himself doing quick mental calculations. If Harold had achieved 87 confirmed kills over 2 tours, he had been averaging more than 1 successful engagement per week for 2 years. That wasn't just good shooting. That was a level of combat effectiveness that placed him among the legendary figures of military history. "My God," Wells whispered. "You were one of the ghost snipers. I've read about operations like yours in classified reports, small teams working independently, targeting high-value individuals behind enemy lines." Harold nodded slowly. "That's what they called us, ghosts. We'd go out for weeks at a time, just me and my spotter. Live in the jungle, move at night, take our shots and disappear before anyone knew we'd been there." He paused, his eyes looking past the assembled crowd toward something only he could see. Young men playing deadly games in a place that didn't want us there. The silence that followed was different from the quiet that had accompanied his shooting. This was the silence that came when people realized they were in the presence of living history, someone who had done things that would be studied and discussed. Long after everyone present was gone, Rodriguez was the first to speak. "Sir, why didn't you mention this when you arrived? We would have treated you very differently if we had known." Harold's laugh was gentle but carried a note of sadness. "Because I didn't come here to be treated differently, Chief. I came here as Harold Mitchell, retired machinist from Ohio. The other fellow, the one who could put bullets where they needed to go, he's been asleep for a long time. Today was the first time in 40 years that I let him wake up." The admission revealed more about Harold than any number of statistics could have. For 4 decades, he had buried the warrior inside himself, choosing instead to live as a quiet civilian who raised a family, worked an honest job, and tried to forget the things he had done in service to his country. The man who had terrorized enemy forces across Vietnam had become someone who fed birds in the park and read bedtime stories to grandchildren. "What made you decide to shoot today?" Morrison asked, genuine curiosity replacing his earlier competitiveness. Harold considered the question carefully, his fingers tracing the worn leather of his gun case. "I suppose I wanted to see if the old skills were still there. After my wife passed last year, I've been thinking a lot about the different people I've been in my life. The sniper, the husband, the father, the grandfather. Today felt like maybe it was time to let one of those people say goodbye properly." The emotional weight of his words settled over the crowd like a blanket. Here was a man who had served his country with distinction, returned home to build a quiet life, and had now returned to his warrior past for what might be the final time. It was a story that spoke to the hearts of every military person present, all of whom understood the challenge of reconciling their warrior selves with their civilian lives. Lieutenant Commander Wells stepped forward and extended her hand. "Mr. Mitchell, it has been an honor. What you've shown us today will inspire our people for years to come." Harold shook her hand with the same gentle grip he had shown all day. "The honor was mine, ma'am. You've got good people here. Take care of them."